Okay, so the subject I'm covering here, I've covered before. Um, just a quick disclaimer, by the way, I'm not a heavy smoker, just smoke occasionally, especially on more reflective issues. But anyway, today 120 people were slaughtered in Baghdad. Now, if this had been almost anywhere else in the world, it would have been really, really big news. Was the headline news on the BBC, but it's become such a regular occurrence in that country and that city that sadly it's no longer shocking. It's just not, it's almost like a normal day in Baghdad. This particular attack or series of attacks was particularly brutal. And the fact that the attackers focus on Ramadan, whether it's because people are weakened from the fasting or I don't know what the specific reason is, but it shows their absolute, well, disregard for human life, needless to say. Um, I want to talk about ideology, honesty, and a global problem that we are facing and have been facing for years. I refuse to talk about Islamic terrorists as just extremists or just terrorists. If you pretend that there's no ideological basis for what these people are doing, then you can't even begin to solve the problem. And I accept that the problem is not easily solved. Of course, it's not. Frankly, it may never be solved. But you can't even begin to address the issue if you can't even acknowledge what it is. I came across a very interesting meme. I posted it to my Facebook timeline because I fundamentally agree with what it's saying. And the meme reads, people have rights, ideas do not have rights. And on one half of the picture, it shows these outlines of a range of people, black and white, disabled and otherwise, male and female, and so on. On the other side, it shows symbols of religions, of political parties, and so forth and so on. Now, the argument here is a simple one that the fundamental basis for human rights is that people come before ideologies. Ideologies, no ideology, is above scrutiny or critique. No religion is above critique. And it is irrefutable that there are many, many Muslims who are basically in denial about Islamic extremism. This is a complete fact. It's irrefutable. But it's very difficult in our politically correct Western societies to really talk about this. It's even harder, frankly, in Islamic countries. If you talk about it in Islamic countries, you're killed. If you talk about it in Western countries, you're called a racist or an Islamophobe. And this is something of an intellectual dishonesty going on here. Someone used the expression an intellectual wilderness. That is essentially what we are seeing when it comes to the problem of Islamic extremism. It's almost like we are in we are in 15th century Europe, and it's a case of Galileo or any of the other great thinkers couldn't talk about science in case they were accused of blasphemy. Simply saying Islam has a problem with violence, whilst it is a statement of fact, that should be an easy thing to say, but it's not. It's not, because there's so many people who are stubbornly denying what's so obvious. Now, the caveat I always make, and I'll make it again, is that I'm well aware the majority of Muslims are not violent terrorists. I get that. But quite frankly, if you're more offended by the image of your religion than the violent acts done in the name of your religion, then you have a bad attitude, and that is not going to solve the problem. So if you are a peaceful Muslim who just goes to the mosque, mind your own business and all the rest of it, and you turn around and say, oh, Islam's a religion of peace, and they're just terrorists, you're not helping the situation. You may think you're defending the image of your religion, but all you're doing is placating the extremism by refusing to acknowledge what it is. I'm not saying you support it, but inadvertently you are in denial about it. You are being an apologist for it because you will not acknowledge what the problem is. And this, unfortunately, is a very, very prevalent issue. Every time there is an atrocity carried out by an Islamist group, whether it be Baghdad today, Dhaka yesterday, Istanbul a few days before, whenever this happens, and it happens on a very regular basis, somewhere in the world every day, in fact, um, there are excuses. This is nothing to do with Islam. This is a religion of peace. Let's stop with this intellectual dishonesty. It's bad enough that there are Muslims in denial, but there are many on the political left who are not Muslims, but they've convinced themselves that they're being open-minded by pandering to this nonsense. And I really, really, really feel frustrated by it because it is just dishonest. Um, if people say to me, all Muslims are violent terrorists, I will say, no, that's rubbish. If people say to me, Islam is a religion of peace, I'll say, well, every single day we see the contrary. You cannot say groups like Islamic State, Boko Haram, Al Shabaab, both versions of the Taliban, Al Qaeda, the list goes on and on and on. All of these groups who themselves purport to be acting in the name of Islam, you cannot say that they've got nothing to do with Islam. They may not be interpreting in the way that you want it to be interpreted to the world. They may be distorting it, and I'm well aware in many cases, they pick and choose what they want from the Quran. In some cases, they might not even read the Quran. But when you have a situation like what happened in Dhaka is actually a glaring example. The attackers specifically said, recite verses from the Quran and we will spare you. Now, if that is not a glaring indictment of Islamic extremism, then what is? You cannot tell me the attackers who went into that restaurant in Dhaka are not motivated by an extreme form of Islam. You just can't say that. And people might say, oh, well, what about the Westboro Baptist Church and so on? Do you think they're Christians? Actually, I do. I would say they are extreme Christians. So I hold the same standard to all religions. The monks going on rampage in Burma, burning mosques and so on, they're extreme Buddhists. The Hindu nationalists lynching Muslim neighbours in India because they may have eaten beef, they're extreme Hindus. I'm not an atheist, but I do understand their frustration. I do understand why they get angry at the denials of religious extremism. And I think they feel angry because if you're saying, oh, terrorists have no religion, well, then you're essentially saying that terrorists are atheists. Then you're tarnishing atheists with that. Terrorists may not own a religion, but to say they don't have a religion it's just rubbish. When you get young men who are blatantly from a conservative Islamic community, whether it be in rural Pakistan or wherever, to say that they're not Muslims, it's nonsense. They come from a Muslim background, and you cannot pretend otherwise. You can't just say these people wake up one day, oh, they decide to kill infidels, but they're nothing to do with Islam. They come from Muslim communities. They're brainwashed for whatever reason it is. There's a range of factors that we can have a long, long debate about the causes of terrorism, unemployment, poverty, whatever it is. But fundamentally, that religious dogma, that religious zealotry, is at the very core of their thinking. And ex-Islamists will testify to this, people who have been radicalized and they have taken a different path in life because they realized it was going to lead to nothing. I'm sure most of them will absolutely confront this idea that it's got nothing to do with Islam. And I'm always seeing these sort of posts like, here's an example. A Muslim doctor saved me, so I will never say that Islam is a religion of evil, or Muslim rescuer pulled out some child from an earthquake, and so forth and so on. It's not rocket science. There are good Muslims, of course there are. That does not mean that there are not bad Muslims. Let's stop with these lazy generalizations that all Muslims are pure, because it's bullshit. If you if you say that Islam is perfect, Muslims are not, then by extension you have to acknowledge that there are bad Muslims. You can't argue that there isn't. And I think this needs to start with governments. It needs to start with secular governments just coming out and saying, yes, this is a problem. Call it for what it is. It's one of the few areas I agree with the Republican Party in the US when they're saying that the Obama White House is reluctant to use the word Islamic extremism or Islamism. It's an area I agree with them, and it's one area that I am frustrated with the Obama White House. Trudeau in Canada is doing the same thing, and it's one area I get annoyed with the political left, because for all their talk about gay rights and women's rights and progressive politics, they are strangely quiet when it comes to Islamic extremism, which contradicts all those things. So the hypocrisy is astounding. And like I say, like this intellectual black hole. Anyone who talks about it needs to be very, very careful, because they could very easily be slandered as an Islamophobe. If an Islamophobe is deemed to be someone who hates all Muslims, then there's absolutely no way anyone could accuse me of that. If an Islamophobe is someone who is frightened of aspects of violent Islam, then probably most people are Islamophobes in that sense. Look, this is a worldwide phenomenon. It happens every day in different parts of the world. And it's true you get extremists in other religions, of course you do. And in some cases they are just as abhorrent and violent and extreme. But I do believe that Islamism is more widespread. I do believe that it is exported more. And I do believe it has a, a pan-Islamist effect that goes beyond the extremists in other religions. Now, you may get Christian evangelical preachers who, rail against homosexuality and so on. But generally speaking, Christians don't blow themselves up in marketplaces, nor do Hindus or Buddhists. This is something that is unique to Islam, and there's no escaping that fact. I am starting to come to the conclusion and agree with those who argue that maybe Islam does need a sort of Martin Luther to reform Islam, drag it into the 21st century. Because Islam itself, as an entire religion, we can't say it's all bad, of course not. And you cannot simply dismiss something that is followed by 1.6 or 1.7 billion adherents around the world, maybe closer to 1.8 billion now. So you can't just dismiss that as all bad, of course not. There's many, many positive aspects that come from organized religion, but there are also many bad aspects. And when people come out with this victimhood mentality lines, like, oh, stop calling all Muslims terrorists, actually very, very few people do anyway. I've seen very, very few people actually say, oh, all Muslims are terrorists. And the Western media, far from being irresponsible, is at times overly politically correct. Quick point, by the way, some people were arguing, oh, why is the Istanbul attack not covered by Western media? Not true. A few days ago, the BBC had a tribute to the victims of that atrocity. The question could be reversed. Did Turkish media care much about the Orlando victims? Or maybe they were just ignored because they were gay. So I really, really get fed up with this victimhood mentality that the whole world's out to get Muslims. Islam is a major religion. Muslims are all over the world. It's not like they're an oppressed minority. Most Islamic majority countries, a point I've made before, have a track record of intolerance towards minorities, violent intolerance. And whilst it is true that you get individual hate crime incidents against Muslims in Western countries, generally speaking, those situations are dealt with very seriously. Until recently, Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh refused to acknowledge Islamic State was on the ground. And her government even tried to blame the victims of those sickening attacks. When you had Islamist thugs cutting people up with their machetes simply because they were either non-Muslims or atheists, or I believe in some cases secular or moderate Muslims. It is necessary that we use these terms because you can't generalize people. So long as I live in a country where free speech is guaranteed, I will say these things. And, I always talk about the question time test. If I was on Question Time, it's a British debate program. We usually get a number of politicians and public figures and they debate the issues of the day in front of a studio audience. I sometimes talk say to myself, well, what would you pass a question time test? Would you be willing to sit there on a panel and say the things I'm saying in this video? I hope that I would be man enough to do that. I know God or Allah strike me down if I'm too much of a coward to speak my mind, because I think this is extremely important. Of course, it's wrong to generalize all Muslims, but frankly, if that is the worst that Muslims have to deal with, is listening to Islam being called a violent religion, it's nothing compared to what minorities go through in Islamic countries. There's simply no moral comparison, because you can find examples of hate crime happening against Muslims in the West, and it's wrong. Of course, it's wrong. I will always, always, always condemn if a Muslim who's minding their own business is attacked by some drunk yobs. It's wrong. Of course, it's wrong. But the point is, we have hate crime legislation to deal with that sort of situation. The fact is, in many Islamic countries, far from doing something about the problem, the governments openly encourage it by enacting blasphemy laws and other such abhorrent acts. And usually the only thing that changes the track is when a major atrocity occurs. Then the governments start getting a little bit tougher. But usually it's too little too late. And that may be the case in Bangladesh. Bangladesh needs to be very careful because it could go down a very dark path if this continues. Bangladesh is a secular country. It's not an Islamic theocracy, unlike Pakistan and other examples. So Bangladesh has a choice: either go in the direction of Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, or go in the direction of proportionally more liberal countries like Indonesia or Malaysia, which themselves are far from perfect. But this is a reality. And if that means people misunderstanding me, if telling the truth means being misunderstood, that's something I'll just have to risk. I'm not brave. There's people who are far braver than me who live in these countries and who do speak out. And I have enormous respect for them. But truth must prevail. Honesty must prevail.